My youngest son called me from the University of Texas, and he'd had a fight with his girlfriend that night, and he called on a Sunday night, and I spent about an hour on the phone giving him all kinds of great advice. And the next morning when I got to my office, they were yelling at me to get on the phone, and it was my other son at the University of Texas. My youngest son's girlfriend had been having an argument later that night, and she shot him in the back of the head. Other son told me if I wanted to see him before he died, I better get to Austin. By the time I got to Austin, there were over 100 years of sobriety waiting for me at the airport. That took me to the hospital and let me say bye to my son. And there were 150 people from my club that went to his funeral in East Texas. Took a day off work. My first reaction was to want to kill his girlfriend and kill everybody she knew. And I prayed about it a lot, and I prayed for her a lot. And I finally, because of what y'all had told me and how y'all had told me to do stuff, I finally was able to call her on the phone, tell her I was praying for her, and I forgave her, and got to have that rock removed from my back. And I get to help a whole lot of people that lose kids today in the program. Because it's a pain that you can't understand unless you've gone through it.
Well, hello, friends of Bill W. and other friends. You have landed on Sober Speak. My name is John M. I am an alcoholic, and we are glad you're all here, especially newcomers. Newcomers, that is, both to recovery as a whole and newcomers to this podcast. Sober Speak is a podcast about recovery centered around the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. My job here on Sober Speak is simple. My job is to provide a platform to the amazing stories of recovery all around us. Consider Sober Speak, if you will, your meeting between meetings. Please remember, we do not speak for AA or any 12-step community. We represent only ourselves. We are here to share our experience, strength, and hope with those who wish to come along for the ride. Take what you want and leave the rest at the curb for the trash man to pick up. Hello, boys and girls. That was the voice of Mr. Bob S. that you heard at the beginning of this episode. And guess what? You are going to hear so much more from him in just a moment. But first things first, this episode is brought to you by Mr. Joe G. By the way, when I say that name, Joe G., it makes me pause and think of, for whatever reason, G.I. Joe. But I digress. This episode is brought to you by Joe G. Joe G went to our... Joe G. That's kind of... That sounds strange when I say that real quick. Joe G went to our website, soberspeak.com, clicked on the donate tab, and made a contribution. Thank you so much, Joe G, for your generous contribution. This episode is for you. And I, ladies and gentlemen, will be the chairperson for this meeting between meetings, and I am truly honored, and I'm doing the little namaste hands, and privileged to serve all of you who will be listening in. All right, just a few things here before we get to Mr. Bob S. Believe it or not, we have episode 100. Can't even believe it, coming upon us. And I thought about what to do, if there's anything special to do. And I tell you what, I'm going to put a call out there for any of you to either write in via email, John, John, at soberspeak.com, or send me a Facebook message, or send me an Instagram message, a direct message on Instagram, or you can even send me a voicemail. And if you're not sure about how to do that, write me, John, at soberspeak.com, and I will make sure that you get the link to do that. But nonetheless, what I don't want this to be is some sort of self-congratulatory effort. But what I'm asking you to do, if you can, is to write in and talk about any of the speakers who may have meant something to you throughout this last what, year and a half, close to 2 years now. Gosh darn, time has flied. But if any of them has meant something to you, and you can remember where you were when you were listening to that, and somehow you can add some texture and color and nuance to the situation. And by the way, I would love to pass on your messages to the guests that I have on the podcast. And you know what? Who knows? Maybe it wasn't a speaker that influenced you, but maybe it was some listener feedback that I read during listener feedback time. Maybe that is what helps you. I would love to hear about it, and I would love to read it or play it if it's a voicemail on our 100th episode. But nonetheless, I just thought about that right before I started to record this episode here tonight. All right, once again, we will be having another Sober Speak Live. It's coming up on December 6th in Frisco, Texas with Miss Brenda J. And if you have not heard Brenda J before, you are in for a treat. I would highly suggest that you go back and listen to episodes number 50 and 90. That's 50 and 90. All right. I wanted to start this out tonight with an email that I received this week from Bill C., who has been one of the guests on the program. And it's just one of those emails where he sends out quotes from the Big Book and other things. And by the way, if you want to get on his email list, send him an email to Bill C., BILLC as in Charlie, at kitchentableaa.com, and he will get you on his list. Go ahead and tell him you heard it on Sober Speak, all right? Nonetheless, this is something that I picked out from one of the emails he sent earlier this week, and it said, "We found the great reality deep down within us. In the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found." That's Alcoholics Anonymous, page 55. Let me go ahead and read that again, all right? "We found the great reality," in capital letters, great reality, "deep down within us. In the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found." And that so much caught my attention this week. All right. Another thing, I hope you're having a good week. I want to let you know what was going on with me this week. I had dinner with my friend Jimmy D last night. Some of you may have heard him on this podcast in the past. He's been on 3 different episodes. And so he was explaining to me what he is trying to accomplish as trustee of our area in North Texas and throughout AA as a whole. And so it got me thinking, okay, why do I do this podcast? You know, why am I doing this? And every once in a while, I have to kind of pull back and reflect on that. And I got to thinking, and I've said this in other words before, and that is, I pray, folks, that by listening to this podcast, you in your life are able to get a sense of what the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous can do for you, especially if you are new, if you are newcomers. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not thinking about the people who have been around a long time either, but people, I realize that sometimes this may be the first exposure to people that are to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 steps and Al-Anon and the other recovery programs. And I hope that you are able to glean some sort of insight from the amazing people, the men and women that I bring in here to share their experience, strength, and hope on this podcast. And keep in mind, none of us, all right, represent AA, Al-Anon, any of the other recovery programs we're talking about on here, but we don't represent it, but we are examples that AA and Al-Anon work. And I do realize, oh my goodness, I think about this all the time. I think about bringing this message or carrying this message. And I know from the bottom of my heart, I am not perfect at carrying this message. I do know I fall short in many ways, but I'm so thankful that you guys come back and you listen. and you give me meaning, and you give me purpose, and you provide me feedback. And this thing has been a journey like no other for me. And as I have said, just so you know, many times over, if you have the choice between supporting this podcast or listening to this podcast, and support, if it's a choice between that and supporting financially and otherwise your local groups or attending meetings at your local groups, please go to a meeting. Put me on the back burner, because the real work is happening out there in the meetings. I'm just hoping that somehow I can serve as a prompt to get people into the meetings of recovery where they can find the solution that they need. All right. I'm going to do a little listener feedback on the front end this time. Then I'm going to talk about Bob S., and we'll get into his episode. Listener feedback. Rye writes in, I love that name, R-Y. Now, I'm done having kiddos, I think. At least anyway, I'm not planning on ever having children again. And but if I was ever having a child again, I may think about naming that child Rye. It's a girl, R-Y. Rye writes in and says, by the way, the title of this email was Podcast Genius and Facebook group. Got my attention. I swear I saw that and I go, who's she going to be talking about? And then she says, hi, John. I hope this email finds you well today. I'm writing to commend your podcast prowess and genius at SoberSpeak, as well as fulfill my duty as a true alcoholic and selfishly ask you to do something for me. Well, you know, Rye, I appreciate your compliment. I do not consider myself by any stretch of the imagination a genius. Whether I have prowess or not is up for debate. But nonetheless, she says, I'm almost 9 months sober, and that's great. And I just discovered this podcast through my network here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Well, I'm glad you're out in North Carolina, right? Anyway, she says, I'm listening every chance I get to your podcast, in parentheses, which is often, since I take a lot, in real big capital letters, of public transportation. Thanks to my friends at the blank dealership, it's a car dealership, who think for some stupid reason I should have been paying my car payment in capital letters every month. The nerve, she says. Anyway, the podcast is a great calmer downer for me. Oh, that's a good way to put it. A great way to feel connected with others in the room, sharing their experiences, strength, and hope. Thank you for this blessing of a podcast. Oh, thank you for listening in, Rye. You have many fans over here in the South, North Carolina. She says, oh, also, could you please add me to the super secret Facebook group? Also, thanks for all you do, Rye K. Well, Rye K, we got that out to you, that invite, and I'm so glad you wrote in. On the Instagram, Mr. Frederick, by the way, if you're not following me on Instagram, I am at, what am I at? SoberSpeak, all one word. And I read all my direct messages. Federico writes in and he says, hey, John, thank you for your podcast. Hugs to you from Uruguay. Well, thank you, Federico. I appreciate that. Is it Uruguay or Uruguay? Nonetheless, I'm glad you're listening in. Dave wrote in on the Instagram and he said, hey, John, just listened while jogging in the United Kingdom, Great Britain. Thanks so much, Dave. We'll keep on jogging and listening. You're doing two good things at once there, my friend. Nikki writes in, and Nikki says, I've been listening to your podcast for about a month now. It gets my day started off in an amazing way. Well, thank you, Miss Nikki. I sure do appreciate it. And as I always say, I'm so glad we can be a small part of your recovery. Thank you for letting me and the guests that I bring in here into your life. John writes in, and this is absolutely beautiful. I love this one. John writes in and he says, John, by the way, I like his name. Even though you don't spell it right, he spells it Jon. But nonetheless, he says, John, love the show. It's given me so much hope. I'm on day 4. And that's what this thing is about. It's about giving people hope, and it's about newcomers and giving them some sort of exposure to the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. All right, now we're on to Mr. Bob S. All right, so Bob S., this is part 2. If you didn't catch Bob S. part 1, you owe it to yourself to go back and listen to this. It's the previous episode here, so that'll be episode 97. This is episode 98. And it says, last week, we covered Bob's, what did we cover? We covered his visit to the White House, his, what I would call encounter with a SWAT team, and a lot more. Nonetheless, on part 2 here, we're going to talk about felonies. We'll talk about misdemeanors. We'll talk about straitjackets. We're going to talk about a guy named Lucky that Bob met in jail. Yes, I just said that. A guy named Lucky that Bob met in jail. I love it when Bob says in this episode, what goes around comes around, and you cannot outgive God. Loved it. We're also going to talk about something that was very uncomfortable, at least for me. We'll talk about the death of Bob's son. And he's also very open and honest about his struggle with prejudice. Once again, folks, if you want to be in the secret Facebook group, send me your email associated with your Facebook group. Associated with your Facebook account at John, John, at soberspeak.com. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Bob S., the one and only Bob S. Enjoy. Okay, everybody, so we are once again sitting here with Mr. Bob S. And just in case you did not catch the last episode, Bob S., go ahead and give your sobriety date if you wish, Mr. Bob. Introduce yourself.
I'm Bob S. I'm a grateful alcoholic. I've been sober since the 17th of December, 1984.
All right, so we started out recording Bob last time thinking we were going to get through his story, but he has quite a background, to say the least. We talked about, and if you didn't hear the first episode, please go back and listen to it, but he talked about his upbringing. He talked about being an outside linebacker at the University of Texas. Talked about how his, I guess his forte in life was fighting, drinking, and chasing women. Do I have that right, Bob?
That's it.
He talked about his visit to the White House with President Johnson. We talked about his PTSD and his time in the Marine Corps in Vietnam. And then we talked about his, we'll just call it an incident with the SWAT team when he went into the board of the company he was working for and put a shotgun in some guy's mouth. We talked about the time where he went down to the jail in LaGrange, Texas, and kind of shot up the police station. And then they ran a background check on him after that. Imagine that. And they found that he had 28 charges against him. And that's where we kind of left it off. So we never really got to the point to where we got sober with Bob in his story. So I wanted to have him back in for another episode. So, Mr. Bob.
we're close to getting sober.
Good. I'm so glad.
There were 28 felony charges. There were over 100 misdemeanor charges. So I mean, I was just getting wired.
You had 28 felony charges
28
and over
felony
100 misdemeanor charges.
Over 100, yeah.
And so, how were you not in jail?
I don't know. I guess they were just scared of me. I just wasn't. I just never had gotten caught. Computers caught up with me. If it hadn't been for, that's why I've always hated computers. If it hadn't been for computers, they never would have caught me. Anyway, they took me to jail in Austin, and I was just barely. By the time they got me to jail, I was just barely coming out of it. I was just barely getting a little bit sober. So I figured it was not a fair deal. I was in jail in Austin, Texas, and
now you have a lot of that saying this is not fair.
It was not fair. It's not fair at all. And there was a great big old fat jailer sitting over there working on his books, and I knew there was something wrong with this situation. And I said, "Hey," do you not know that I'm an important Marine war hero, and that my dad's a real important doctor in Dallas, and I played football here at the University of Texas." And this jailer shook his head and kept looking at his papers. And I said, "Hey, did you hear me?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "That's not your lucky day." I said, "What are you talking about? It's not my lucky day." He said, well, my dad's a chiropractor, and I was in the Navy, and I went to A&M. So I thought, nope, not my lucky day now. But he was wrong. He was wrong. Sherry Hartzell and those friends of mine that were petroleum landmen with me that were former Marines came to see me in the Austin jail, and they brought me one of those little funny cards, and they said,
a funny card?
Yeah, those little cards that got all the funny steps on them and the funny prayers on them, and the little white cards we used to pass out.
Oh, okay, so like AA literature.
Yeah, an AA card that had everything on it I needed to know, and they said, "Here, just keep this." And I looked at them, and I looked at the steps, and I said, "Well, my life's not unmanageable." And they said, "Oh yeah, who's managing it?" And I said, "Well, state of Texas for right now, but who knows later." And they said, "Good, we'll just keep the card." And I folded the card up and kept it in my pocket, and they transferred me around from Austin. They transferred me around to 7 different counties that they had charges on me, and they finally let me out. John Hill worked his magic, and they let me out on all of them. On every one of them, I got probation under the conditions that I go to the VA hospital for mental evaluation and post-traumatic stress stuff. And so I went and checked into the VA in Waco.
Which there was some truth to that, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I was released from the last jail, I think, in Tyler on a Friday, and I was supposed to report to the VA on Monday, but I didn't really make it till Tuesday because I don't know what happened to Monday. Something happened Monday, and Saturday, Sunday, and Monday I drank enough to kill most people. And by the time I crawled up the stairs at the VA in Waco, it took them 4 more days of blood tests to get one that didn't show I was legally intoxicated.
Wow.
So I drank enough to kill most people, and I checked into the VA, and they kept me in a straitjacket at the VA for a couple of days because they kept thinking I was going to hurt somebody, and I wasn't hurting anybody but me, and so after 6 weeks at the VA, they gave me a bunch of tests. Really, they started in the 5th week. They started asking if I'd take all these extra tests. And first test had, less than 100 questions on it, but they had a bunch of alcohol questions, and I didn't like that, so I just answered them honest. And then the next test had like 300 questions, 333 or something like that, and so I just answered that as honest as I could, and then they had one more test. It was a 999 question test. It took 2 days, and because they kept asking stuff about alcohol, and I was just aggravated by then. And the only reason I did it because it was going to help me get out. That was my one question to him: is this going to help me get out any faster? And they said, "Oh yeah." So then they came and they asked me if I would be the subject for grand rounds out of that particular VA hospital in Waco.
Subject for what?
Grand rounds. There's 12 major VA hospitals in the United States. Each one of them has 1 month during the year where they present a subject for grand rounds, which is where you sit in a room with all the doctors that have been in your treatment team and all the psychologists and all the psychiatrists. They go through your whole case and they make recommendations and whatever. And so I said, sure, I'll, if it lets me get out of here, I'll do whatever y'all take. And they put me in a waiting room. It was a doctor's waiting room and had doctor's books all the way around it. Well, my dad was a doctor. I knew how to find all the dirty pictures, but I also knew how to find everything else in the doctor's book. I knew how to find everything about PTSD there was to find. And so I speed read everything in there. I was in there probably an hour, and I read everything they had in that library about PTSD. I could have answered any question about PTSD and made them believe it. And they took me in this room, and they all the people gave reports, and they had a big chart up at one end of the room, and they had some overlays on it, and they said, Mr. Schaefer, so these are times in your life when you have gotten in the most fights, when you have been the angriest, when you have pissed off the most people. And I looked at it, and I had the dates pretty much right, and I was thinking about that. And they had another one. These are the times in your life when you've done all your criminal activities, and these are and I said, well, yeah, that's chart's pretty right. They had 4 or 5 charts like that, and in the last chart, they pulled it over, and they said, are these the times in your life when you've drank the most? And I looked at it, and there was a drinking question. I couldn't stand it. They were asking me that, and yeah, that's pretty accurate. I knew it. I'd given them the information. I knew where it came from. And so as I was looking at the chart, they flipped the next page over, and the next page over, and the next page over, and it was all the same line. All the same line. And they said, now, we want to suggest to you that maybe you're not crazy, that maybe you have a bad allergy to alcohol, and it may be that allergy to alcohol lets you do things that you would not ordinarily do and act in ways you wouldn't ordinarily act, and that's pretty much destroyed your life. And
what was your reaction to that?
It was like I'd been hit in the chest with a sledgehammer. They had to ask. They asked me twice. They said, now, we're going to let you loose from here. What are you going to do next? And I was just staring at the chart. I thought, well, crap, I'm an alcoholic. My mother was an alcoholic. I don't like alcoholics. I don't want to be an alcoholic. And it just amazed me.
Had that thought ever occurred to you before that time?
Absolutely not. I never thought I was alcoholic, except when those guys from Alcoholics Anonymous came to see me in jail in Austin. I knew what they were there for. I knew that's because they'd told me several times when they'd seen me drinking when we were all working together that I had a problem. And
so did you have an inkling this whole time, though, that something was wrong with SWAT teams?
No. No, I was just wired that way. I just, I had been that intense, and some of us run to the gunfire, and that's what I would have done in any case that there was, and I've not been afraid of many things in my life. The no fear deal. That's just who I was, and the only thing I was sort of afraid of was keeping living the way I was living, and so they asked me the second time. They said, "Well, we're letting you loose from here. What are you going to do?" And I said, "There's some friends of mine that are in Alcoholics Anonymous that have suggested that I could probably benefit from that program, and I think I'll go find them." And see if they can help. And they said, well, we think that'd be a real good idea. I walked across the street from the VA in Waco. I bought with some money I had left on me, I bought an old car. I drove down to LaGrange, and the house had been ransacked, but most of the alcohol was still in that big closet. And
what do you mean it had been ransacked?
Oh, somebody had been in there and they'd been looking for stuff, and things were turned over, and the family had not been back there, since all this had happened, and somebody had gone in, somebody had taken some of my guns and stuff like that, and I went and looked at the house, and I did not take any of the alcohol with me. I did not take any of the bottles of alcohol. I took a sleeping bag and some clothes, and I headed for Dallas. And when I got to Dallas, I called a friend of mine's uncle, who I knew was a member of AA, and I told him what had happened, and asked him if he could please take me to a meeting. And he took me to a Dallas North meeting, and I picked up a Desire chip that night, and I was sleeping. I had a lot of relatives in Dallas who were afraid of me, and they, I couldn't get in their houses or anything, and I don't blame them. I mean, I was a pretty scary character at that time, and I had a good friend that would let me go over to his place and use their guest room out back and take showers and stuff every morning once his wife went to work, because she was scared of me too. So I'd do that, but I slept in the parking lot of Dallas North for 2 months.
Really?
During the winter, during February and March of '85, and slept in the back seat of my car, and then I'd make a 7 o'clock meeting, and because they had coffee in there in the bathroom, and
7 o'clock a.m.
7 o'clock 7 in the morning, and I'd go shower and stuff. Then I'd go back to the club and make a noon. Then I'd make a 6 or 8 o'clock every night. So I was making 3 or 4 meetings a day, and
did you like it when you finally got into it?
I hated it. I hated it, but I knew that these people were either the craziest people on the face of the earth, or they'd found something that worked, because they were having a good time. I was not having a good time.
So you considered it like a sentence, so to speak?
It was almost a death sentence. How was I ever going to have fun again? And these idiots would laugh. There were guys hugging guys, and guys telling each other that they loved them, and just all kinds of stuff like that just did not sit right with me at all. That's just not the way people of my ilk did things, and I didn't want any part of that. And I'd been in there about 2 months, and they had a speaker that was supposed to come on Wednesday nights, and the speaker wasn't going to be there, so it had called and canceled. So they were going to show a movie about the Catholic priest, Catholic priest AA movie, and I sure didn't want to watch a movie about a Catholic priest. So
you're talking about Father Martin?
Okay, Father Martin's movie. And so I got in my old car and my mobile home from a parking lot, and I went over toward a friend of mine's place. Same guy that stood in for me when I got married, and Don had a refrigerator full of beer, and had a well-stocked bar, and had a closet full of drugs, and I mean that's and about halfway over to his house, my car pulled in the parking lot of that the big Methodist church on Inwood and Northwest Highway, where Citywide is held now, and pulled in, and my car pulled underneath a tree, and I got out and got on my knees, said the most fervent prayer I'd ever said in my life, and it was, God, I hope you're listening, and I don't know if there's another alcoholic anywhere in the world, but I'm pretty sure I'm one, because I'm going for some relief. I'm going to kill this pain. Please help me. And so after I stayed on my knees for a few minutes, the answer I got, clear as a bell, just like he was talking to me like a father. And was well, good. Maybe the steel will start working for you now. And the message was go back to the club, tell some people what had happened, and see what works now. So I got back there. I got back to Dallas North as a meeting was getting out that I left.
So just real quick, people can't see you right now. Obviously I can. You're sitting here right across from me. That's 25 or 35 plus years ago now, correct?
35, yeah.
35. And that still brings up, it looks like that still hits a real emotional spot within inside you. Do you remember what was so special, if you will, about that particular moment? Had you been talking to God before that?
Well, I'd been for a couple of months in this AA stuff. I kept hearing all this God stuff, and then, every time they'd say God, I'd shut my ears, and I didn't want to pray at the end of meetings because I was afraid he'd hear me and know where I was, and I just had a hard time buying the God deal to start with, and then just all of a sudden that was, I was faced with going back to the way I'd been living, or faced with turning it over to him, and I just flat turned it over.
So that was a turning point for you.
Oh, they say that's the only step you can do perfectly, and I, most probably believe them, but I did that about as perfect to the tips of my toes, from the tips of my toes to the bottom of my head, and everything in me admitted that I had a power and asked God to help me. That I had a problem and asked God to help me.
How long were you sober at that time?
2 months.
2 months, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so you turned the car around. You went back to the meeting where they're showing the Father Martin film.
They were just getting out of the meeting, and I stopped 2 or 3 of the guys that I'd known there fairly well, and told them what had just happened, and we all went to Taffy's, and
is that a restaurant?
Taffy's was a restaurant where Dallas North always used to go. It's been closed a lot of years now, 15, 20 years, but that's where you could always find all of us in the evening after meetings and stuff, and it started working. It started working from then on. By I woke up the next morning with a different attitude. I also woke up, about 2 days later with an apartment that I'd gotten because some money had coming in from me selling some of my oil stuff that I still had, and so I got an apartment, and things started working.
All right, so let me take a little break here. We will be continuing our conversation with Bob S. in just a moment. Just a reminder, you were listening to Sober Speak. You can find us on the web at www.soberspeak.com. You can also find the donate button on our website, and you can use that if and only if the Spirit moves you to do such. Please keep in mind, this is a podcast funded by you, the listener. Sober Speak is a self-supporting organization through our own contributions. We are not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution. We do not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorse nor oppose any causes. All right, now back to Mr. Bob S. All right, so you've had your turning point. You go back to the meeting. You go out to Taffy's. Now all of a sudden you have an apartment. Take me from there.
Well, I guess I ought to speak about sponsorship. I was going to the 7 o'clock in the morning meetings I was going to. There was people kept telling me I needed a sponsor, and there was a little guy in there, Dick B, that he drove a BMW convertible. He wore lots of gold. He was married to a real good-looking woman. He had a swimming pool at a real nice house, so he had everything I wanted.
There you go.
And so I asked him to be my sponsor, and then he insisted on going to probation meetings with me. I was on intense probation. I had to go every 2 weeks, and
what's it called? Intense probation?
Intense probation.
What is that?
Oh, you have to didn't have to wear, at the time they didn't have ankle monitors like they do now, but you had to call in twice a week, and then you had to go in once every 2 weeks to pee in a deal. And I mean, they rode you, they checked on you a lot more than they do today, and just intense probation. And Dick wanted to go with me, so
he wanted to go with you down to the probation.
Oh, he wanted to go. Yeah, he wanted to make sure I was being treated well or something. And so he went down there with me. And the time he went down with me, they always run the computers again when you're in there.
Those darn computers are always catching
I hated those computers. And anyway, I went in the back, and he sat out front, and they ran the computers, and they found 2 or 3 things they hadn't charged me with yet. So they carried me out in leg irons and handcuffs, and 2 great big sheriff's deputies carried me out to the car. And as we walked through the room where he was, he looked at me and fainted. He passed out in the chair because he just couldn't believe they were taking me back to jail. And my first thought was, man, I need a tougher sponsor than this. This is not going to get it. So, I went, they took me to jail. They ran all the stuff again. And I was in there feeling sorry for myself. And I looked out the window, and you could, from Lou Sterrett, you could look out the window and you could see a liquor store down on the freeway. And I thought, man, I've been being good for months, and this isn't getting any more than this. I'm getting out of here. I'm going to go buy me something. I'm going to get loaded. I'm going to go back to my old way of doing things, and I'm going to get some respect back and get a lot of my toys back. And I just about had half made up my mind to do that. And I went in to get to eat, and they put trays of bologna sandwiches in there, and there's this one guy, this black guy that was in there that had his ear half bitten off and had teeth knocked out, and his nose looked like it was broken, and they called him Lucky. And Lucky sat down at the bologna sandwich tray, and he folded his hands, and he bowed his head, and he'd tell he was saying a little prayer, and I was just looking at him. And he said, you can say anything you want, but he said, I'm just thanking God for this food. And for all I've got going. So I said, well, here's another one. I gave him a tray, and I went and laid down on a rack, and I thought, man, that guy doesn't have much to thank God for. You've got a lot of people working on getting you out of here right now. You haven't done anything new to get arrested for the last bunch of months. You need to change your attitude. So I went to find Lucky. They let him out. So Lucky's one of those little angels that come along. My whole story is about seconds and angels, and Lucky's just one of those little stories, one of those little angels that was there when I needed to change my attitude, and he changed it. He gave thanks for being. He said, "I've just given thanks for being alive," and that's So I was out of there in a couple of days and got a new sponsor. Got a sponsor everybody says was real mean and real tough, and he was a wuss too. I had him for about 26 years, and he died down at Whitney. But I mean, sponsorship.
Who was that?
Mike Warren.
Okay.
Mike was, I went to say, and Mike looked at what I was doing. I was still trying to do some of my oil deals. He said, "Look, you're spinning your wheels doing this." He said, "Why don't you come to work for me, and I'll, my brother's got an insurance agency, and I own part of it, and they need somebody to set appointments. You're good on the phone, so come in here and set appointments." Well, I went into the place, and I set enough appointments in a week for 5 or 6 more agents, and so the next week I went in and started setting them, and I worked half days, and he said, "Look, I said, all I can pay you is like $13 or $14. I said, $13 or $14 an hour. I'm a $1 million landman, and he said, "Yeah, but not now." He said, "You need to go in and you need to start somewhere over again." So anyway, it was about 3 months before he put me in charge of a division, then in charge of a telemarketing division, and then so I started making some real good money. And I worked for him most of those. I worked for him probably 14 or 15 of those first 26 years that I was sober, and it was neat always having him down the hall. I could always go in my sponsor's room and shut the door and visit with him. A good man, good man.
So, talk me through some of the steps. Do you remember doing like your first, fourth, and fifth step?
Oh, absolutely. The fourth step, that little stupid card they gave me, I still kept it. The one that they gave me in jail, and it had that four-step stuff on there. And I thought, well, there's no way in the world that I can write down all. I mean, I can't do a four-step. Man, I'd go to jail forever and ever if they know some of the really bad stuff I did. And so I just put that off as long as I could, and finally Mike taught me into doing one. I did probably 3, 4th, and 5th steps before I did one honestly. I mean, really honestly. I mean, over the first 3 or 4 years I was in, I just, and it wasn't that I didn't want to be honest with him or anybody else. I just had a hard time being honest with me. I had a hard time facing my part in things and seeing where I was at fault and asking for and taking the steps I needed to take to change them.
So when you took those first 2 or 3, 4 steps, whatever you did you know you were holding back at that time? Did you consciously
I knew I was keeping secrets. I knew that, there were some secrets that I was keeping and I just was not going to let go. And they always said, you're as sick as your secrets. But then one of them said, well, you're also just as well as what you'll tell. And every time I'd do one, I'd get a little more honest. Every time, I got benefit out of every one of them because out of every one of them, I identified some patterns in my life that I needed to change. And I knew I needed to change them. And so I, took the measures I needed to do to change those. One of when I finally did a completely honest 4th and 5th step. I mean, the best. I've done, 12 of them, maybe over 35 years. But when I did the first really honest one, there was a couple of things that I spotted, a couple of patterns in my life that it was really keeping me from being of maximum service. Y'all told me, lots of stuff, but one of the things y'all told me was that, that for an alcoholic of my ilk, it would probably behoove me greatly to get into a lot of service work. So, so I started doing I didn't have any problem with that. One of the greatest things and the greatest service things that we did was our Tuesday night men's meeting at Dallas North. We used to call it the Jason meeting. I was on the board of Intergroup. A good friend of mine, I'd replaced a good friend of mine, Blake Miles. Blake has gone on to that. Blake ended up going back out after 17 years, I think, and then he ended up blowing his brains out. Wow. And he's a super good guy. But Blake called one night and said that his brother had a stepson who had dove off a boat at the University of Tulsa, drunk, and hit a rock with his head and snapped his spine. So the kid was a quadriplegic. So 5 of us took a meeting up to the country to this quadriplegic kid up in Capel or something. And when they brought the kid out and laid him down, the kid, when he got back home from some rehab, he talked some friends of his into coming over, bringing a bottle of vodka and some straws. He couldn't even move, but he could sip through the straws, and took a bunch of pain pills with the vodka and tried to check out that way and didn't. And he, when they carried him in, put him on a couch, he looked at us and at the 5 of us, he said, "You all can say anything you want, but I just want to die." And every one of us looked at him and thought, man, if I looked like that, I'd want to die too. And each one of us told him how we got there. And he let us come back the next week, and there were about 13 people the next week, and one of them was a guy that was in a wheelchair, and he could identify with him. And so then the kid let us start coming every Tuesday night, and he ended up going back to North Texas when he got his degree from North Texas. I mean, it's tough going to school being a quadriplegic, and but when he got his degree from North Texas, there were like 15, 20 of us there. When he got his master's, there were 50 of us there. When he got his doctorate, there were 100 of us there.
Wow.
That kid now handles a treatment center in Colorado, and it's for quadriplegics and people that have that kind of difficulties and that are drug addicts and alcoholics and stuff. So that meeting has touched. I mean, we've had that meeting going for 26 years, 27 years, and that meeting has touched more people than you can imagine. But that's the kind of service work we did. And we took him meetings. We took him to Denton to his school every week from down here. And out of that has come the moving crew that we have at Dallas North. We've half the Saturday mornings during the year, we end up helping somebody move that can't afford movers or needs help.
In fact, didn't you come from that this morning?
I did come from that this morning. You bet. And that has kept a whole bunch of kids sober, especially new guys that get out there and do it for fun and for free, and get to bond with. You really bond with somebody when you're carrying a hide-to-bed sofa down 3 flights of stairs and stuff like that. You got little bitty corners, and it's real tough. I mean, it's a neat deal. But I can't sit in a meeting anywhere in any club in North Dallas and there not be several people in there. I moved, and and that came back. There's only 2 things I've learned in this deal for sure. For proof positive, sure, and that's what goes around comes around, and you can't outgive God. I'd been sober for a long time. I'd been sober for 15 years. When my youngest son, called me from the University of Texas, and he'd had a fight with his girlfriend that night, and he called on a Sunday night, and I spent about an hour on the phone giving him all kinds of great advice. Just tell him how, to look out for himself and the things that we do. And the next morning when I got to my office, they were yelling at me to get on the phone, and it was my other son at the University of Texas. My youngest son's girlfriend had been having an argument later that night, and she shot him in the back of the head. And so my other son told me if I wanted to see him before he died, I better get to Austin. So I called Southwest Airlines. They held a plane up for me for a little bit, and I got on it. And by the time I got to Austin, there were over 100 years of sobriety waiting for me at the airport. That took me to the hospital and let me say bye to my son, and we donated, all his organs and everything else, and through that, there were 150 people from my club that went to his funeral in East Texas. Took a day off work, and my first reaction was to want to kill his girlfriend and kill everybody she knew. And I prayed about it a lot, and I prayed for her a lot. And I finally, because of what y'all had told me and how y'all had told me to do stuff, and because y'all had showed me what you did, I finally was able to call her on the phone, tell her I was praying for her and I forgave her, and got to have that rock removed from my back, and I get to help a whole lot of people that lose kids today in the program, because it's a pain that you can't understand unless you've gone through it.
Wow! Oh my goodness, Bob! I had no idea.
Oh yeah.
And so that And I'm just sitting here thinking about how, I mean, I know your background.
Yeah.
I know where you came from. I know you're a killing, fighting machine. And for you to come around and do something that is very counterintuitive to what your thought process was for so many years.
Yeah. And one of the things in that force buy, I know where I was going. I can get sidetracked here, but one of the things that I really didn't like the very most about myself was being as prejudiced as I was. Not necessarily about color, but about lifestyles and a lot of other things that went on. And I was at, and just to show you how much of a God deal that, that this was when I finally got honest with a 4-step, and I was talking about in the 5th step, I was identifying all those patterns I needed to change, and that was the one I really needed to change the most for me, was my prejudiced behavior and my being judgmental. And I chaired a meeting at Dallas North at a Saturday noon men's meeting, wore a Marine Corps jersey, and this goofy-looking guy, this tall, goofy-looking kid that had a ponytail, had peace sign on around his, or peace chain around his neck, earrings in his ears and his nose, and and just goofy-looking, came in and sat down a few minutes after the meeting started. And he finally somebody called on him, and he introduced himself, said he was from Longview, Texas, and he was over here, and he was glad we were here. He just saw the sign on the back of the building and decided he'd stop in there before he went and drank. He was only about 6 months sober. And I said, oh, we're glad you're here and stuff. And I remember thinking when he walked in, man, I'm sure glad I don't have to work with somebody like that. Okay. We all went to Taffy's afterwards for lunch. I sat in my customary seat of grace right in the middle of the table, and where we shoved all the tables together. And he came in and he sat right across from me. And and everybody filled in the tables, and he finally said something. He said, oh, were you in the Marine Corps? And I said, no, I just found the jersey. And then everybody laughed, and I said, yeah, I was in the Marine Corps. And he said, well, my dad was in the Marine Corps too. He said, but he died in Vietnam. And oh, crap. And then I felt bad. And I said, oh, yeah. I said, well, I'm so sorry. What did he do in the Marine Corps? And he said, well, he jumped out of airplanes and swam out of submarines. And I said, yeah, what year did he die? And he said, well, 1965. I said, what is your name again? He said, Mark E. And I said, was your dad Shelton? And he said, yeah, how did you know? I said, son, I held him while he died.
Oh, my God.
So, I handed up, after lunch, after I hugged him and stuff. After lunch, I took him back to my house, and I showed him a bunch of pictures of his dad, and I answered for about 6 hours, I answered all the questions he had about his dad. Kid still lives in Longview, hardly ever comes to Dallas. He's still sober. He tells that as part of his story.
Oh, my God. Oh, my goodness. Oh, I'm kind of welling up over here myself. I can't believe that, Bob.
Yeah. Yep, it's a God deal.
The miracles of sobriety, huh?
Absolutely.
The miracles of sobriety. Bob, I've so much enjoyed this.
Good. Me too, bud. I needed it.
Yeah, I needed it too. And hopefully the listeners, well, in fact, I know you have people listening in all 4 corners of the world, and that's why I like to do this podcast, because there's people like you that I get to frequent, and I see, and I visit with, and I meet them in meetings, and they don't all get to meet people like you. And I want to give this to a platform to people like you that can go out to all 4 corners of this world, and they can be exposed to the recovery that you have experienced for so many years now. God bless you. Thank you for coming over.
My pleasure.
All right, so I'm going to read real quick from the page 164 of the big book. Abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to Him and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find and join us. We shall be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you will surely meet some of us, like me and Mr. Bob S. here, as you trudge the road of happy destiny. May God bless you and keep you until then.